Harry and Meghan are in the upswing, because what I'm hearing is people saying, well, Meghan was right. It's impossible being a member of that family. And people who think that Kate might have had some kind of a nervous breakdown, they're looking at what happened to Meghan. They're looking at what happened to Diana. And they're saying, yeah, it's impossible to live in that family. Meghan and Harry may be right. So in a way, I think in terms of their status, in terms of PR in America, it's gone up as a result of this.
How interesting, because over here all the polls are, they're getting more and more unpopular.
Yeah.
America is very important, Harvey, to the royal family, to the monarchy. I think if you took the American love of our royals away, you would be taking a very, very large chunk of their viability as a working, serving monarchy. How damaging is all this being, do you think, to the brand of the royal family and the monarchy?
I'll tell you why I think this is really damaging. That a lot of people in America, honestly, myself included, think that the royal family, it's just this stodgy group of people behind, this big wall at Buckingham Palace, and that William and Kate were kind of a breath of fresh air, that they were young, that they kind of connected to young people around the world, that they understood media. And now the way I think a lot of people are viewing this is they're using the same playbook as the 70 and 80-year-olds in the palace. And so there was this feeling and maybe even hope that William and Kate would dust off, what had been going on in the palace for years. And I think now they're kind of viewing them as part of the problem.
What happens when one of the loudest critics of Harry and Meghan is forced to sit and just listen? No interruptions, no dramatic walk-offs, no shouting over guests, just silence. Because that's exactly what unfolded in a moment that's now getting a lot of attention. When Piers Morgan, a man who has built an entire brand on attacking Meghan Sussex, had to sit there on live TV while a very different narrative was laid out right in front of him. And not just by anyone, but by someone deeply connected to the media world. And what was said? It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't exaggerated. It was something far more powerful. It was honest. Let's break this down. Because what was said in that moment cuts straight to the heart of everything Harry and Meghan have been trying to tell the world for years. The idea that maybe, just maybe, Meghan was right all along. That being part of that royal institution isn't just difficult. It's impossible. Now, think about that for a second. Because for years, the UK media, led loudly by figures like Piers Morgan, have pushed one very specific narrative, that Meghan Sussex was the problem, that she couldn't fit in, that she was disruptive, that she was somehow the cause of all the tension. But now we're seeing something shift, and it's not coming from Harry and Meghan themselves. It's coming from observers, from media insiders, from people who are starting to connect the dots. Because when people look at what happened to Meghan, and then they look back at what happened to Diana, they start asking uncomfortable questions. Questions the monarchy and its media defenders would rather avoid. Why does this keep happening? Why do women who marry into that family end up under such intense pressure? Why does history seem to repeat itself? And here's where it gets even more interesting. Because in that same conversation, something was pointed out that should make the royal establishment very nervous. The shift in perception, particularly in America. For a long time, the royal family has relied heavily on international admiration, especially from the United States. That global fascination, that soft power, that sense of glamour and relevance, a huge part of it comes from how they're viewed outside the UK. And now, that image is starting to crack. Because what's happening is this. People in America are increasingly looking at the royal family and seeing something very different from the fairy tale they were sold. Not a modern institution, not a progressive one, but a rigid, outdated system that struggles to evolve. And that's where Harry and Meghan come in. Because whether you love them or hate them, one thing is undeniable. They disrupted that narrative. They pulled back the curtain. They spoke about things that weren't supposed to be discussed publicly. And for that, they were punished, relentlessly. But here's the twist. All that criticism, all those headlines, all those attacks, they may have backfired. Because now, more and more people are saying, wait a minute, what if they were telling the truth? And that's exactly what was hinted at in that now talked about segment. That Harry and Meghan's standing, particularly in the US, is actually rising. That their credibility, their relatability, their version of events, it's starting to resonate more. Meanwhile, back in the UK, the media continues to push polls and headlines suggesting the opposite, that they're unpopular, that they're irrelevant, that they've lost support. But here's the question nobody's really asking. Support where? And according to who? Because public opinion isn't a monolith. And when you step outside the UK media bubble, the picture looks very different. And that's what makes that moment where Piers Morgan had to sit quietly so significant. Because for once, the narrative wasn't being controlled. It wasn't being shouted down. It wasn't being twisted into outrage. It was just laid out, calmly, clearly. And the reality is uncomfortable, because it challenges the idea that the monarchy is always the victim. It challenges the idea that criticism of the institution is somehow unfair. And most importantly, it challenges the idea that Harry and Meghan are the villains in this story. Let's talk about that for a second, because for years the media, especially in the UK, has framed this as a simple story. Loyal royals versus rebellious outsiders, duty versus disruption, tradition versus trouble. But real life isn't that simple, and what we're starting to see now is a more complex picture emerging. A picture where the institution itself may be part of the problem, where outdated systems clash with modern realities, where individuals who try to speak up are pushed out. And suddenly Harry and Meghan's decision to step back, it doesn't look so shocking anymore. It looks understandable, even logical. And that's the shift that's happening right now, slowly but surely. Because when people hear comments like, "It's impossible to live in that family," it sticks, it lingers, it makes people rethink everything they thought they knew. And here's the thing, that idea didn't come from Harry. It didn't come from Meghan. It came from someone observing the situation from the outside, connecting the dots. Diana, Meghan, the pressures, the scrutiny, the relentless media attention. It's a pattern, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Now, let's bring this back to Piers Morgan, because his silence in that moment speaks volumes. This is someone who has spent years dominating conversations about Meghan Sussex, interrupting, dismissing, mocking. But in that moment there was nothing to interrupt, nothing to spin, nothing to shout down, just a perspective that's becoming harder and harder to ignore. And that's where things get really interesting, because the more this conversation grows, the more people start questioning the media itself. Why were certain narratives pushed so aggressively? Why were certain voices amplified while others were dismissed? Why was Meghan in particular subjected to such intense scrutiny? And once those questions start being asked, the entire structure of the narrative begins to wobble. Because it's no longer just about Harry and Meghan. It's about trust. In the media, in the institution, in the stories we've been told. And that's a much bigger conversation. So, where does this leave us? Right now, we're at a turning point. A moment where the old narrative is still being pushed, but a new one is quietly gaining ground. A narrative that says, maybe Harry and Meghan weren't the problem. Maybe they were reacting to a system that couldn't accommodate them. Maybe they saw something, experienced something, that others are only now beginning to understand. And if that's true, then everything changes. Because it means their story isn't just about them. It's about the institution they left behind, and what that institution represents. And that's why moments like this matter. Moments where the conversation shifts, where new perspectives break through, where even the loudest critics fall silent. Because sometimes silence says more than words ever could. And as this story continues to unfold, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The narrative is no longer one-sided. People are listening, they're questioning, they're re-evaluating, and whether the monarchy and its media allies are ready or not. That shift isn't going away. So, the next time you see headlines attacking Harry and Meghan, ask yourself, what's not being said? What's being left out? And who benefits from that narrative? Because in today's media landscape, the loudest voice isn't always the most truthful one. And sometimes, the most powerful moment is when that voice is forced to be quiet. If you found this breakdown interesting and you want more content that cuts through the noise and challenges the mainstream narrative, make sure you hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications and join the conversation. Because we're just getting started.